Welcome to a bonus series on the Life Giver podcast. Made possible by the USO, these bonus episodes are from a monthly series called You're Leaving Again, where the USO is following Matt and I during our deployment, and we are sharing our authentic story with you. Whether you're going through your own deployment, are geo-baching, on an unaccompanied tour, or maybe getting ready to, this series aims to be the first of its kind. Real life, gritty, but resourceful content aimed to help you keep your marriage and family strong while you're apart. So whether you're a military spouse or a service member, this series is for you. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, or head outside for a walk and listen in as Matt and I share what we are learning apart with you. Last time on the Life Giver podcast. Assertiveness is like not being passive anymore, and we're actually going to say the thing that is like, it's the elephant in the room. It's the thing that's between you and your spouse. It's the thing that's keeping you distant. So we've got to have the courage to say these things out loud. It's just how we do it. So Matt, if you can respond to those two if you want to, or go from there, what are your thoughts?
I was going to go ahead and hit up aggressive, just for the sake of time. So just initially, my thoughts on aggressive is you have to be able to diagnose when you're dealing with an aggressive communicator. It usually falls, I think, in three areas. They are either a cruel person, and they're just cruel by nature, and that they get joy and pleasure out of hurting another person. They're dealing with a deep-seated insecurity in themselves. And the only way that they can overcome that insecurity is to try and hurt other people, or to be demeaning or to be demanding in their communication. And those aren't mutually exclusive, or they're feeling threatened. They're not cruel, they're not insecure, but they're feeling threatened. And so they're coming across and they're communicating in a very aggressive way. Now, I know that when Corie and I were struggling in our communication, and whenever we have a really good argument, it's usually I'm the pursuer, but I don't really know what I'm trying to work out. I just know that we're trying to work it out. We're trying to work through it. And so where Corie's trying to process her feelings, her thoughts about whatever it is that we're talking about, I'm trying to get resolution because I want to have connection. And so what comes across as aggressive is really me trying to pursue her through communication, but really doing so in an immature and in an absent-minded and thoughtless and sometimes can be hurtful manner. And so being able to diagnose, is this person just being cruel? Is that what they just enjoy doing? Is that why they're communicating aggressively? Are they dealing with some level of insecurity? And they're trying to place themselves in a different position through their communication. Are they defending because they feel threatened, or are they pursuing? And so it may take a while to be able to try and, I don't want to say diagnose, but determine where that aggression in the communication is actually coming from. But I tend to think that it happens more so with individuals that are extroverted, or it tends to happen with people that have been passive for far too long.
Yeah. And
then once that passivity has been far too long, all of a sudden, all that rage and anger and resentment builds up and festers. And then all of a sudden there's that explosion, which comes across like a complete shock, because the person that's been encountering the passive communicator for a very long time has never expected that any of that was underneath the surface at all. And that really kind of goes into the defending and feeling threatened. Whenever you have that threat response, it's really amazing what our amygdala will do to us and make us how we will act in order to be able to shove away the perceived threat. So any thoughts on that, Corie?
Yeah, no, and I was looking at the spectrum, and I thought to myself, this is really, I could see myself over the past month, on this spectrum, right? Like when I was not sharing with him what was going on, that was a passive form of communication that wasn't healthy. Like I'm holding inside, I'm not sharing for whatever reason out of insecurity, or we talked about that already as far as the reasons why I didn't share what was going on. Passive aggressive might be me, hoping he's going to ask if I had a hard day instead of me just saying that I had a hard day, or me being snarky. I don't think I did this, but like if there's kind of hints that I'm dropping, which is really unfair to do to your spouse if they're a distance away, right? When you have fewer senses to, all of our five senses, when we talk about communication, your five senses, I can tell you the more of your five senses you can use to communicate, the less there's going to be miscommunication, right? So that's why video chats, and that's why we're doing this over video, because you can see us, you can hear us, we're engaging as many of the senses as we can when we're apart. So, that's why Matt a second ago goes like, you have this, strong look on your face. Well, I'm just reading the comments, right? So you get these nonverbal cues. And so the more of your five senses that you're using when you're communicating, the less room there is for miscommunication. And so if I'm just not really communicating my words to him and hoping he's going to pick up on it, well, we're already missing out on things like physical touch, the ability to hug and calm each other's bodies down. That's a form of communication. Like all of those other things we normally would have in person, of course, there's going to be even more room for miscommunication. And so, of course, I do see, we can definitely lean towards the aggressive side when we're apart. If we're kind of bottling all that up, or if we're kind of unleashing our resentment out on the other person when they're powerless to control the situation, if we're just being aggressive, character assassination, calling each other names, shouting at each other, telling them that, you don't want to hear what they have to say, all of that is an aggressive form of communication. So really quickly, before we wrap up with this hour and go into question and answer, assertive communication is where we want to be. This is what's healthy. Okay. Healthy is, I'll never forget this when I was working with women out of prison and we were teaching relapse prevention. It was the first time I had to teach this similar material. And I remember reading the statement. I kind of memorized it and just kind of took it with me, where assertiveness is you have a right to your thoughts, your feelings, and your opinions. You also have a right to ask another person to change their behavior if it's destructive to you. As a human being, you have those rights. In other words, meaning when you're feeling something, that's valid. It is a valid emotion, and you shouldn't and can't talk someone else out of those feelings as if they don't matter or they're wrong, right? If they feel a certain way, it's very real to them and it's valid, okay? If you feel alone, that's valid. Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, differentiate real quick, feeling and thought. You can have a valid feeling that's tied to an irrational thought. So yes. Can you unpack that?
Yes. And I think it's through our communication, assertively communicating, that we start discovering what's rational and irrational, right? That's why it's a dialogue. It's a communication back and forth. And so when we say assertive communication, you have a right to express those thoughts, feelings, and opinions. That doesn't mean that those thoughts, feelings, and opinions, that they may not change over the course of the conversation, right? But when we are first feeling a certain way, it is okay. I'm speaking maybe to those that are on the passive side, right? Sometimes you've got to be able to say, I have this feeling and it's very real, and I need to be able to say it to you. I just need to tell you what's going on within me. And then it becomes that dialogue. But aggressiveness would be to say, that's not right. That's not real. That's not what you really meant. Like that would be aggressive.
Aggressive is actually trying to force the other person into feeling or thinking exactly what you are feeling or thinking.
Yes.
And then passive is I'm willing to think or feel whatever anybody else is. I'm just trying to go along to get along.
Yes.
Where you're desiring harmony above autonomy or the ability to express yourself as an individual. You said something, and I read it on the second bullet on the right side, is the being able to change your mind, is being flexible enough to grow together. And if we expect our significant other to grow and change and be able to change their mind, we have to do that as well. So if there is something that I'm expecting Corie to grow on, then I need to be able to grow on it as well, because I'm not trying to just create, a little, clay person as I mold them. I'm trying to experience the dynamic part of life that is going to make me scared at times. It's going to make me afraid. It's going to make me, it's going to challenge me. It's but you can't like selectively numb, like Brene Brown would say. You can't selectively numb. You can't avoid all those bad things and then expect to have all the good things. And so you've got to be able to, Excitement comes from unknown adventures, from where you're like, ooh, this is new, this is different. I don't know where we're going to PCS. All right. Now there's some bad stuff about PCSing. There's also some good stuff. Maybe there's a Panera nearby. Maybe there's even better bagels. So
the key to this assertive communication, really, when it comes down to it, is that you have the right to express your thoughts, feelings, and opinions, but you want to do so in kindness. And what I mean by that is without violating the rights of the other person, right? If we violate the rights of the other person to their thoughts, feelings, and opinions, that's where we are becoming aggressive. So in other words, guys, like, how do I... let me see if I can go back to when Matt and I were struggling early on in our marriage. When I started to set those boundaries, I was doing my best. I didn't know that I was trying to practice assertiveness at the time, but what I was attempting to do was own my own feelings and go, this communication that we're doing, that we are living through, is not okay to me. This is not feeling healthy to me. And so I'm going to communicate that I want something different, that it needs to change, and that I'm uncomfortable with it staying like this. That was me being assertive, to own how I felt, express what I thought, and ask for change. And it doesn't work, because believe me, I tried to do it in unhealthy ways of screaming that, of not saying it at all, and trying to be passive, or, just to give him the cold shoulder after an argument. And none of that was effective. And so really kind of it came to a point where I just said, I'm just going to own how I feel and put it out there. But I'm also going to hold the boundary and say, if we are going to grow closer together and we're going to heal this, something's going to have to change. And I'm allowed to say that. I'm allowed to express that. But if I can say it in a way that doesn't shame him, that doesn't character assassinate him, that doesn't run over his rights. And Matt, one of the things that you kept saying to me over and over again back then was, I have a right to be upset. I have a right to my feelings. And that was so true. Like, I think I was like, don't be so angry, right? Don't be so mad, because his expression of anger and frustration was louder than my expression as an introvert of anger. And we had to learn how those expressions come out and then how to both do that in healthy ways. But I remember you saying all the time, I have a right to be upset at something that is upsetting. And I had to keep going back to that and going, actually, that's true. He does have a right to his feelings. He has a right to express them. We just have to figure out as a couple, how do I ask you to express them and let you own them and have them, but express them in a way that I can also hear and meet in the middle somehow.
And I think one of the hard parts, especially early on in marriage, and if you don't get it fixed, it just continues all the way through marriage, is the expectation that any of us know how to do this well just to begin with. So we talk, all with people and have relationships all the way up to marriage. But we don't ever really get trained on it. We don't ever really have feedback mechanisms. Literally, our feedback mechanism for learning how to communicate in school is whether or not somebody continues to hang around us or we develop a group of friends. But then that even becomes this little very insular group that just affirms whatever your communication style and skills actually are. And so you begin to think, I must be able to communicate well. Why? Because these other people hang around me. Well, they may not be able to communicate well either. And so you just may be all this self-reinforcing group. And then you get married and you're like, I know what this is. I know how to do this. I've watched movies. I watched my parents. I'm either going to mimic what they did or do the exact opposite. And I'm going to get this right because I know what marriage is. And it's like getting in a car, having never understood how a car works or functions, but you've seen them drive. And so you think you got it pretty good. And then you get on the highway and you're just trying to keep up to speed. Well, the first day for a kid on the highway trying to get up to speed, you're going to be so anxious and you're going to be white knuckling it. Within a couple of miles, your level of frustration, anxiety, and fear is going to be so high. And that happens for all of us. So the number one thing I will say is that if you're having problems with communication, you need a mediator. You need somebody that can give you outside advice and guidance that this is going well or this isn't going well. And the beauty of whatever's happened in the last year with COVID is that telebehavioral health has become a big thing. And so if you have the opportunity to engage a telebehavioral health provider, that your spouse is in the States and the other person is deployed, and they can do that with within the parameters of their their state licensure, you can have like 3 people in different places sitting there working through communication and have somebody mediating for you. Because there's what we think we say and how we think and feel we're coming across. But oftentimes in our head, we're like, this is going to be brilliant. This is going to be phenomenal. When I let this go, this is going to be the best thing in the world. And then you say it and you're like, it's like taking a puzzle and just throwing it out on the table. And you're like, that doesn't look like the picture on the box.
I think that might be just you.
Yeah. So...
no, it is true. It is true. So thank you for that. That's an important caveat as we go into these questions. It's so hard to know what's happening in your world, what's happening behind these questions. There's so many variables behind why people communicate the way that they do. And so it's almost impossible for us to answer some of these questions without having more information. And so what we're going to do in answering these questions is kind of apply it to the material, almost like a hypothetical question, kind of making up some of those details. So if we address one of your questions, just know, we know that we're probably getting it wrong. And there's a whole lot more to the story than is in this question, but we wanted to tie it back to the material today and kind of answer it through that lens. Okay. So, and some of these will go through faster than others. We're going to, Matt, let's try to move through them quickly because we tend to get stuck like on 1 or 2 questions and kind of camp out there. And so we're going to try to go through these faster. Definitely go to the Q&A box if you have something in particular you want us to address, and we'll do the best we can. Question number 1 is, why is it easier for me to share my life decision, or I guess how I make life decisions, or the decisions I'm trying to make, big decisions, with my spouse, but it's harder for him to give me the same courtesy? So that's a big question, and there's a lot of variables that can be behind that. I'll kind of take this one as far as, here's the thing. I think regardless of how your spouse responds, especially if you're making big decisions or trying to navigate how to make big decisions, it's always important to share those life decisions and how you're trying to make them with your spouse. And if it's harder for them to share that, it could be because they're an introvert and they're just not sharing all the details of all the thoughts that they're having to try to make that decision. And maybe they get to the end and then tell you what they decided. That could be something that's going on. But even just being able to go up to your spouse and assertively say, I call it turning the lights on in the relationship with our communication. Like, you can hear behind the question, there's already disconnect in the couple, right? Like, I want my spouse to communicate and they're not so much. And so I feel disconnected. And so I say, turn the lights on with our words, right? Where we can say, I love you. I really want to know what's going on in your inner world. When you don't share it with me, I feel disconnected. That's an honest statement, owning your own feelings, not saying that they're doing something that's horrifically wrong, but it is being able to say, this feels destructive to our relationship, and I'm kindly asking you to do something different, or at least tell me what's going on that keeps you from sharing it. A lot of times I find for most couples, it's really a difference of personality and how we kind of interpret information. I can't tell you how many couples it comes down to introvert and extrovert, really. Okay, Matt, why don't you do this next one? How do you keep relationships strong with your kids through absence? So it's like communicating with kids.
Right. So there are actually several ways that you can do this. And we have all the tools. We have so many more tools now than we used to. The fact that when Corie and I got married, that our first computer had a 1 gigabyte hard drive, and we were like, this is amazing. Who would ever need an entire gigabyte on a hard drive, right? And when I was compiling the book for Corie, I was even able to go back and look and see the videos that I'd made with the boys. So this comes down to age, and it comes down to what needs to be communicated. And so if you've got young children and you're just trying to be a face and a voice on a screen, then that's very easy to do, and to be able to send those things home and to be able to mail them home and to plan things out. We mentioned this when we were talking about parenting, 2 hours of creating little videos of, reading chapters of a book, putting that into the hands of your supporting spouse back home, and then being able to have that for the kids goes a very long way to being able to feed that need for that level of communication. We have teen boys, and based out of that, they have phones and they can text, And so the ability to just be able to send texts maybe throughout the day whenever our time zones are overlapping, to be able to just consistently say, I love you, I miss you, I'm thinking about you, here's what was going on in my life, here's what I was processing. And this communication is important and consistent. It doesn't have to be big buckets. It could be consistent, small drips over time that is a constant reinforcing for your relationship with your children, that I'm thinking about you, that I miss you, and to be able to articulate that. And before I left, I gave both the boys like leather-bound journals, and I'm almost positive they have not written one thing in those things, right? But exactly. So,
but it still taught them the value of this is a way of communicating that I think will stand out to them. And I think it's still worth that you gave that gift to them.
Yeah. So I would also say this, go back and listen to the one that we had on parenting, because we answered a lot of good stuff about how to stay connected with kids while you're deployed.
So we have another question in the question and answer box where it talks about my spouse isn't the best at reciprocating general questions about my life when I'm asking about his. What's a good way to communicate with him effectively so he's more aware of the issue? And they're saying he's a caring person. He just isn't like thinking to ask those questions. Honestly, I think that again, I'm going to say this a million times about turning the lights on, because that's what assertiveness is. Assertiveness is like not being passive anymore. And we're actually going to say the thing that is like, it's the elephant in the room. It's the thing that's between you and your spouse. It's the thing that's keeping you distant. So we've got to have the courage to say these things out loud. It's just how we do it, right? So even just you actually wrote that beautifully. Whoever wrote that, you actually wrote it really well. It's actually being able to go to your spouse and say, hey, I noticed that when I'm kind of sharing, I'm asking you how you're doing, you typically don't ask me how I'm doing. And that really feeds me. And it really makes me feel seen for you to ask me kind of similar questions back. You can ask why, but honestly, I would say sometimes it's a matter of upbringing. It's a matter of what you grew up with and what you saw in communication. And sometimes just using a communication tool like the check-in, we gave that, I think, back in, I can't remember which month we did that, but we did. The check-in is a 5-minute, 4-question check-in that you can do every single time you connect with your spouse. It's what are you physically feeling right now? What's been on your mind? What are your emotions right now? And then what do you need? And just being able to answer those 4 questions and take turns with those 4 questions. You ask all 4, or you answer all 4, and then the other person goes. I think you'll be surprised how much you get from that conversation and connect in that just 5 minutes that gives you a lot of the connection that you feel like you need. So bringing in a tool like the couples communication cards, the check-in, coming up with prompts and questions that are prepared in advance so that you're not, doing the same questions every single time. Bring in tools. If somebody is struggling and it's a weakness of communication, bring in tools instead of just expecting them to just figure it out or be a natural at it. Go ahead, Matt.
I think in relationships, there's always one person that pursues more than the other person. And so there's a difference in the level of pursuit. One person just may feel more comfortable without there being that much forward pursuit, and the other one doesn't. And but there's also different levels according to how we pursue one another. So just because we often give what we expect to get, okay? And if we're not getting, then we will give even more as a way to kind of drop hints. So I'm going to give this more, and I'm really trying to drop a hint that you'll actually like catch on. This is how you love me. And somebody mentioned the 5 love languages. I think you can break that onto even many more. But if you're wondering, like, why don't they do X, Y, and Z? Well, that's not how they're built. I mean, that's how you're built. So you're expressing the love language that you want to have from the other person. And then going back to assertive communication, it's almost like, this is how to love me. This is the best way to love me. And I remember you and I actually have little black books on that,
They're out of print now. We're going to have to make them, I think.
Yeah.
But it was like a whole book of fill in the blank of how to love me. And you're just answering all these questions and then you swap them, which is fantastic. Mm-hmm. Okay. So this question actually comes up a lot when I travel and speak with, especially spouses, but working with couples. It's the question of, as from a spouse perspective, when you're kind of holding all of the responsibilities and the weight of the world's kind of on your shoulders and you're kind of keeping it all inside. And then your spouse comes home and you kind of get to a place where you put yourself so much on the back burner that you eventually explode. That would be going from passive to aggressive, right? Like we didn't have healthy assertive communication leading up to it. Especially I can hear this just happening during reintegration, right? Like I've been holding it all inside. I really need your help. I need you to jump in and take responsibility. And during reintegration, what not usually happens, but what I hear from a lot of couples, especially with rapid tempos, is that you're holding it all inside and you're waiting for your turn. Supporting spouse at home. Service member comes home and they're needing to readjust with jet lag. And then that might sometimes, we're talking about dysfunctional behavior here, rolls into video games or not being fully present and engaged in the home. And then if you've put yourself on the back burner, passive aggressively waiting for that person to jump in and take responsibility and know what you're feeling, then you are going to explode, right? And so I actually had a spouse, one talk that I gave. She was in the back of the room and she was talking about being on the back burner as if like, if you're cooking dinner, she said, when you think about it, and she was trying to make a really good point, but it was really something that stood out to me. She said, when you're making dinner, there needs to be something on the back burner. Like the back burner is just something you got to stir every now and then. And on the front burner is the thing you really need to be attentive to. And she's like, as long as we just make sure that we kind of give ourselves a stir every now and then, we're going to be okay. And I just was like, no, that is not okay. You are so valuable as a human being. You're not going to make it if you give yourself self-care just every now and then when you have a chance. Because you guys know when you have 20 minutes to yourself, you're going to stare at the wall and you're going to think of all the laundry and everything else that needs to get done. And then you're not going to take care of yourself. And so turning the lights on in the relationship means that you go to your spouse and you say, I am exhausted. I really need your help. And when you do fill in the blank, it feeds me. It makes me feel like I can replenish when I can go for a walk and you take the kids for 30 minutes, like give them an actual something that they can win at, give them an example of exactly what's going to feed your soul, communicate that and say, if you can just give me 30 minutes with the kids so I can just go outside and go for a walk and hear nothing but the wind and the birds and not children, then I think it'll help me decompress a little bit. And when you help me with the dishes, I just take a deep breath and I'm just so grateful. And it does so much for me. Like you've got to be able to express that, give them a chance to win, because here's the thing. Everybody wants to win. Nobody wants to lose. Your spouse is not trying to lose and they're not trying to be malicious and they're not trying to hurt you. We just have to speak out loud the things that are in our heart and not be passive about it. But we have to do it in kindness. If you don't, you're just doing it aggressively. We're just swinging the pendulum to the other side. Okay.
What ends up happening usually is that both spouses begin to feel and spiral in their own little areas of hurt for too long, and they end up kind of hiding in their own little holes. And if they're not assertively communicating with where they're at and what's going on with them, and they're really hoping the other person guesses, or that they feel like they've been so isolated and felt like they haven't been understood for so long, that's where that rift begins to grow and people begin to grow apart. And so the assertive communication is really making that leap across that canyon to come to the other side and say, okay, this is where I'm at. This is what's going on with me. This is what I need. And when you do, just like Corie said, when you do X in situation Y, I feel Z. So it's an empowering thing. And we're all, let's be honest, I mean, between the supporting spouse and the serving spouse, or if you're dual military, both serving spouses, we're all exhausted, y'all. Yeah. That's what being an adult is. Being an adult is basically just being it is being exhausted until you fall asleep while you're holding the grandkids. That's adult. All right. That's where we're all going. That's just admit it. We're all headed there. Okay. And
then we're going to get in trouble for that,
And then people are going to look at it and go, can you believe they fell asleep? Yeah, because you exhausted them, kids. You just wore them slap out.
You did this to me.
You did this to me, and naps are happening. All right. So
I love it. The next comment is actually coming off of the other one. I think this is really important for us to touch on.
right.
Somebody responded off of that last scenario. They were responding that it can be really tough when you hold your spouse accountable and you ask them to change something, and then they get an attitude or they get defensive because you've held them accountable on something. And I just want to go back to what we started in the beginning. Assertiveness is, again, being able to communicate your own thoughts, feelings, and opinions, and asking for change in a kind way that's not aggressive, right? But it's owning your own and managing yourself. If the other person doesn't respond to your healthy assertiveness, if they respond in defensiveness, aggressiveness, or passive aggressive in this case, that's not necessarily, I want to be careful on how I say this. I'm trying to say it's not necessarily your fault, although the best we can do is own our intentions of what we're trying to do in healthy communication. But that doesn't mean there's going to be times that you're going to try to be assertive and be healthy, and it's still not going to quite be there, right? So there's room for feedback on that, but there is an element of do the best you can to communicate as healthy as you can, be willing to grow from it. If you get it wrong, be willing to get some feedback. But at the same time, if they don't respond in a healthy way, for me, and then Matt, I'll let you respond. For me, that's the next level of conversation that needs to happen, right? It kind of goes up a level. Like on video games, you go to the next level. Like if I'm communicating, hey, I really would like for you to not play video games tonight. This is not a situation with Matt and I, but I'd really like for you to not play video games tonight and help me with the kids. That would be really helpful. I'm just so tired. And they're like, well, what am I supposed to do? Like, this is the time that I hang out with my friends, and that's just what I do every night, right? If my healthy communication or my attempt at that is not respected, now it's time for the next level of conversation. The next level of turning the lights on in this relationship is now you not being willing to hear what I'm asking from you is now creating emotional destruction and connection destruction in our relationship. And so now I need to communicate that. So when I ask you to help me and you are defensive, or when you don't want to help, this is how that impacts me. And it makes me not want to be close to you. Like, I don't want to be close to you because when I ask for help and you're unwilling to give it, I'm hurt by that. So now we've gone up a level in our communication and what we need to be assertive about. Matt, what were you going to say?
So I was going to say, when you use the word accountable, it implies that there have already been rules that two people have agreed on, and that you are holding somebody to the rules to which you have both agreed on. If you haven't set rules for your marriage or for your household, and people are acting in one way or another in a way that you don't like, and you confront the person, even if it's assertive communication, just be aware that that person may get into a defensive posture and feel like it's not accountability, it's accusatory. And so whenever somebody feels accused of something, they'll naturally become defensive. I'm not saying that you're accusing them by using assertive communication. I'm just saying be aware that if you haven't agreed upon what the rules are for the house, then there's really nothing to hold anybody to accountable to. So backing that up, you have to decide, what are the rules? So when you're talking about communication during deployment, going all the way back to the beginning when Corie and I were talking, we didn't have a rule for, okay, major medical scare happens during the deployment. Do you want to know? Do you not want to know? Yes or no? And now we know we should probably have that conversation. And sometimes you stumble upon those realizations even when you weren't planning on it. But it is key. It's crucial to sit and have family business meetings where you're not just talking about, the calendar that's coming up or the finances in the house. Sometimes you have to go, okay, now what are the rules? And usually we figure those out. We start to decide we need to start making rules for the house only when we have kids. And then all of a sudden we're like, oh man, these kids are unruly. They do whatever they want. Well, as adults, we tend to act like kids and teenagers too, because we figure we can set our own rules. So if you don't want to have that blow up or that confrontation, when there's a good setting and a good opportunity, being able to assertively communicate, here are what I want the rules of our house to be, and for you guys to, over time, to develop and agree on those rules, because rules are in place for you to get to a place that you want to go. If you don't have those rules, you're living accidentally. So first off, you got to agree, what do we want our marriage to look like? What are the characteristics of our marriage, of our house? Agree on the nature of your marriage first, and then go, so what rules do we have to put in place in order to get there? Because if we don't have those rules, we'll never get there. It's the same way with going to, yep, go ahead.
And what happens when somebody breaks the rules? That's right. Where people get stuck on that, right? Yep. I did want to circle back because I had mentioned Steve's comment. I think it was Steve's comment that was up above where I said it was an example of assertive communication, where he said, actually, Nicole said to Steve, right? So that's the couple, Nicole and Steve, where she said, I'm sorry if I'm getting this wrong, but it's your fault, guys, for logging into the same account. Okay. But she said to him, I love you and I love spending time with you, but I need alone time. Now, what's so healthy about that is you can hear the kindness. You can hear, I'm not running over you. I'm actually saying I love you. And that I love spending time with you. So we're pointing out the positive. We're pointing out the connection in the relationship. It's not saying that it's not that it has anything to do with you. This is something I'm communicating my own need for rest and alone time. It has nothing to do with us. So she's validating that and then asking clearly. Franklin Covey calls it straight talk, like straight to the point, very direct, but kind, like I need alone time. And then his response was, I understand, I'm going to go play golf. And he went for 10 hours, right? Because he knows they've had enough conversations that he knows he's coming back to somebody who's more replenished, right? And so he has the freedom to go play golf. She has the freedom to have that alone time. And it all happened because we communicated with kindness and with straight talk. Go ahead.
So I'll say now, if you are deployed or you're both, dealing with a deployment, start now the conversation of what life is going to look like during reintegration. Begin to do expectation management, because that little conversation between Nicole and Steve is a perfect example of the kind of conversation that needs to happen weeks prior to reintegration and reunion, where you need to go, I'm excited to see you, but I would like X, Y, and Z. I'm excited to come home. I'm excited to see the kids, but I also maybe need to go hunting just to be away from people because, Corey's at home with kids all the time. And then service members are with other service members all the time. They're not necessarily getting any of that quiet time themselves. So being able to say that and then go, okay, well, let's look at a calendar. Let's figure out how we're going to work on this expectation, on our expectation management and what life is going to look like when we begin reintegration. That will save a lot of problems for when you both come home and then both want to go do other things that don't seem to work.
Lots of need. Yep. So we're going to wrap up because we could honestly do this for hours. And if you know us, we can. So it's been a joy to spend some time with you. Here's how I would kind of wrap up and vision cast moving forward for you guys as you leave for today. Number one, part of communication takes boundaries. It takes self-awareness of knowing what you need and being able to own your own feelings and not manage the other person, but it's also being kind and letting them have their own feelings too. It's definitely about boundaries, and boundaries come from what Matt was saying, your shared values and the rules around your relationship, and talking through what happens if somebody breaks the rules. What do we do with each other? How do we communicate that we need somebody to change behavior if somebody kind of broke a rule, right? And we're not talking about like loyalty kind of rules, although sometimes that is the conversation, right? But it can be as simple as, I thought one of the rules that we had for marriage is when you come home from a deployment that you're fully 100% taking care of the kids. I wasn't expecting you to check out, right? Like that kind of was not what I was expecting.
I thought one of the rules of marriage, I would say this, one of the rules of marriage should always be, I'm not threatening, we don't threaten to leave one another.
Right. That was even some great advice that we got from some mentors very early on when we needed it the most. Yeah. And so we didn't get to cover timeouts, but timeouts are healthy. They are important. And there are rules surrounding timeouts. It is, it's healthy to call it, but it's also healthy to call a time in and get back to talking again. So there's so much more. And I'm going to throw this last one in really quickly because somebody asked about external family members. And our rule of thumb is talk about it as a couple and figure out your feelings on that. But our kind of general rule of thumb is that, your spouse should be managing boundaries with their family and you should be managing yours, unless we're talking about safety issues. So Thank you for the great conversations, the great questions. It's a really important topic and really a difficult thing to do during deployment. My goal by the time I see you guys again, by the way, the next topic that we're going to cover is a big one. The next topic we're going to cover is how do you recover and restore some of those deeper wounds in your relationship. So if you have dealt with things like betrayal or just hurt, deep hurt, we're going to cover some very difficult topics in the next one because we get questions like that all the time. And sometimes betrayals or deep wounds happen during time apart. So make sure you register for the next webinar that will be next month, and we'll be sure to meet you right back here and take your questions as well for that event. So Laura, thank you so much for having us and for giving us the opportunity to serve this community that we love so much. Thank you guys for giving so much of your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Life Giver podcast. If you're enjoying these episodes, please share the podcast with other service couples that may benefit from the show. If you'd like more information about me or Life Giver, head on over to CorieWeathers.com or life-giver.org.